For centuries, one of America's greatest archaeological mysteries has captivated our imagination. An entire civilization, the Ancestral Puebloans, seemed to simply vanish from the Four Corners region without a trace. Tens of thousands of people gone, their magnificent cliff dwellings abandoned, their cities left to crumble into dust. But what if everything we thought we knew about their disappearance was wrong? What if they never vanished at all? What if the story that science had been telling us was incomplete, obscured by our own ignorance and our failure to listen to the voices that had been speaking the truth all along? The mystery has haunted historians, archaeologists, and the American imagination for over 7 centuries. Museums feature exhibits about this vanished civilization. Books and documentaries speculate endlessly about what happened to them. Academic careers have been built around trying to solve this puzzle. But in 2025, after centuries of mystery, after generations of speculation and theories, the answer finally emerged through an unlikely source. It did not come from the discovery of some hidden archaeological site or a newly deciphered ancient text. It came through the collaboration between Western science and indigenous knowledge, through the courageous decision of a Native American tribe to take control of their own narrative and use modern genetic technology to prove what they had always known. The story begins in the late 1200s, in the arid landscapes where Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah meet. This is a region of stunning natural beauty and brutal environmental challenges. For roughly 1,000 years, a remarkable civilization had flourished in this challenging terrain. These were the Ancestral Puebloans, sometimes still called by their older name, the Anasazi. They had transformed the harsh desert into thriving communities. They built sophisticated irrigation systems that captured every precious drop of water. They constructed elaborate villages, some featuring multi-story structures with hundreds of rooms. They created a complex trade network that stretched across vast distances. Their pottery was renowned for its intricate beauty. Their astronomical knowledge was encoded into the very architecture of their great houses. By all measures, they had achieved what so few civilizations do, a sustainable, thriving society in one of North America's most unforgiving environments. Then around the year 1280, something happened that would reshape our understanding of American history. The cliff dwellings were abandoned. The great houses of Chaco Canyon, which had stood as the spiritual and economic center of their world, the gathering places where people from across the region came together for ceremonial and trade purposes, were left empty. The astronomical observatories built. Into the canyon walls fell silent. The trading networks that had brought goods and people from hundreds of miles away gradually ceased functioning. Within a few generations, the entire Four Corners region seemed to empty out. Archaeologists and historians scratched their heads in confusion and frustration. Where did they go? Why did such an advanced civilization suddenly collapse? Did they migrate elsewhere, or did they simply disappear into the pages of history? Did disease wipe them out? Did warfare destroy their society? Did environmental catastrophe force them to abandon their ancestral lands? For over 7 centuries, this question haunted the American imagination, spawning countless theories and competing explanations. The most common theory suggested that the Ancestral Puebloans had experienced a catastrophic collapse. Droughts had devastated their crops. Disease may have swept through their populations. Perhaps warfare or social conflict had torn their society apart. Some theorized that the entire population had simply died out, leaving no descendants. This narrative became embedded in textbooks, museums, and popular culture. It was a story of rise and fall, a cautionary tale about civilizations that failed to adapt to their environment. But there was a problem with this story. The Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest, including the Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, Laguna, and many other tribes, had always maintained a different account. Their oral histories, passed down through countless generations, spoke of a continuous lineage connecting them directly to these ancient ancestors. Their cultural traditions, their religious practices, their languages, and their architectural styles bore unmistakable connections to the Ancestral Puebloans. They weren't just theorizing about a connection. They were asserting a direct ancestral relationship that had never been broken. For a long time, mainstream science dismissed these oral traditions entirely. Indigenous knowledge was systematically devalued in academic circles, treated as anecdotal and unreliable compared to the supposedly objective conclusions of Western scholarly expertise. Written documents were treated as inherently superior to spoken memory, even when those memories had been maintained with ritual precision across hundreds of years, passed down by designated keepers of knowledge who understood the importance of accuracy and continuity. Native American communities had learned the hard way, through painful historical experience, that their voices were often ignored in the halls of academia. Their burial grounds had been disturbed and desecrated by researchers seeking to publish findings. Their remains had been studied without permission, without consent, and without respect for their spiritual beliefs about the sanctity of the deceased. Their narratives had been rewritten by outsiders who claimed to know better, who assumed Their Western frameworks and analytical categories were universal and superior. Worst of all, this research had sometimes been conducted in ways that caused direct harm to indigenous communities. Genetic research in particular had a troubled history with tribal nations. Scientists had collected samples, published findings, and sometimes made claims that contradicted tribal understandings and oral histories, all without adequate consultation or collaboration. Given this history of broken trust and outright exploitation, when indigenous peoples insisted on their connection to the ancestral Puebloans, their claims were often met with skepticism or outright dismissal by the academic establishment. But science was evolving. DNA technology was improving by leaps and bounds. Researchers were developing new methods to extract genetic material from ancient bones and compare it across centuries. Some scientists began to wonder if genetic evidence could either confirm or refute the oral histories. Could DNA shed light on whether the ancestral Puebloans had truly vanished, or whether they had survived in the descendants who claimed them as ancestors? The answer would require a collaboration between Western science and indigenous communities, a partnership that had been rare and fraught with complications. In 2017, one of the first major pieces of genetic evidence emerged, and it came from an unexpected source. Scientists had extracted mitochondrial DNA from hundreds of turkey bones found at archaeological sites near Mesa Verde in southwestern Colorado. These bones were abundant in the archaeological record because domestic. Turkeys had been important to the ancestral Puebloan culture, used for food, feathers, and ceremonial purposes. The researchers compared the genetic material from these Mesa Verde turkeys to turkey remains found in the northern Rio Grande region, both before and after the supposed disappearance of the ancestral Puebloans. The results were striking. Before the year 1280, the two turkey populations were genetically unrelated in their maternal line. The turkeys of Mesa Verde and the turkeys of the Rio Grande had separate ancestry. But after 1280, something remarkable happened. The turkey populations in the Rio Grande region suddenly began carrying genetic haplogroups or clusters of genes that matched those from Mesa Verde. This genetic signature could only mean one thing. The ancestral Puebloans had migrated from the Four Corners region to the Rio Grande Valley, and they had brought their domesticated turkeys with them. This wasn't speculation or theory. It was written in the genetic code of the animals themselves. Some archaeologists and anthropologists found this evidence compelling. It suggested a narrative far different from sudden collapse. Instead of vanishing, the ancestral Puebloans had packed up their lives and relocated to a new region. Their descendants, the Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley and beyond, represented a continuous cultural lineage, stretching back over 1,000 years. But while this turkey DNA study provided an intriguing clue, it wasn't definitive proof of direct human genetic continuity. It suggested migration, but it didn't establish a clear genetic link between ancient ancestral Puebloans and specific modern Pueblo communities. For that kind of evidence, scientists would need to examine human DNA directly. The challenge that scientists faced was profound and multifaceted. Indigenous communities had abundant reasons to distrust genetic research and the Western scientific establishment more broadly. For decades, academic researchers had taken human remains from burial sites without permission, without consultation, and without any semblance of respect for the communities from which they came. They had published findings that directly violated indigenous beliefs about the sanctity of human remains and the proper treatment of deceased ancestors. They had used genetic data to make claims that explicitly contradicted tribal oral histories, privileging their own interpretations over indigenous knowledge systems that had preserved accurate information across generations. They had treated indigenous peoples as passive subjects to be studied, specimens to be analyzed, rather than as partners in the research process, who should have a voice in how their own history was investigated and presented. Many researchers conducted their work with a colonial mindset, assuming they had the right to access indigenous materials and knowledge without regard for community concerns or preferences. So when scientists began proposing large-scale genetic studies of ancient human remains in the 1990s and 2000s, many tribal nations responded with a clear and firm no. They wanted nothing to do with research that might disturb their ancestors' resting places, might violate their spiritual beliefs about the sacred nature of human remains, or might produce findings that could be misused against their communities. But some tribal leaders began to see genetic research as a tool that could serve their own purposes. If DNA analysis could be conducted on their terms, with their control over the data and the results, it could provide powerful evidence supporting their ancestral claims. It could help them protect sacred sites. It could strengthen their legal cases and disputes over land and water rights. It could validate the oral histories that Western science had dismissed for so long. This perspective led to a remarkable partnership between the Picuris Pueblo, a federally recognized tribal nation in northern New Mexico, and a team of geneticists and archaeologists. The Picures Pueblo had long maintained oral histories connecting their people to Chaco Canyon, the great ceremonial center located 275 kilometers to the west. Chaco Canyon had been the heart of ancestral Puebloan civilization during its peak, roughly from 850 to 1150 CE. The largest and most impressive structure there was Pueblo Bonito, a massive great house containing hundreds of rooms and rising multiple stories. At the center of this great house, archaeologists had discovered a special chamber called Room 33, which seemed to have held particular significance. Here, the remains of individuals had been buried with elaborate grave goods, suggesting elite status. The oral traditions of Picures Pueblo spoke of their deep connection to this ancient place. When their tribal leadership felt their concerns about protecting Chaco Canyon were being overlooked and erased by the U.S. government, they decided to take action. In 2025, their vision came to fruition in the form of a groundbreaking study published in the prestigious journal Nature. For the first time, a U.S. federally recognized tribe had led and co-authored a genomic study of its own ancestry. The Picures Pueblo had initiated the research, worked with the tribal community to define the research questions, maintained control over the genetic data, and directed how the findings would be presented to the world. This was not outside researchers studying indigenous peoples. This was indigenous peoples studying themselves, using cutting-edge science to tell their own story. The research team had collected DNA from 16 ancient individuals buried at Picures Pueblo itself, dating from 1300 to 1500 CE, a period when the people had already settled in their Rio Grande location. They also collected DNA from 13 current members of the Picures Pueblo community, providing genomic data spanning the last millennium of their history. The analysis employed sophisticated statistical methods to examine genetic continuity and relationship. They looked at autosomal DNA, the DNA that comes from both parents and makes up the vast majority of our genetic material. They examined mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited exclusively from mothers and passes down through female lineages. They studied Y chromosome data, which traces paternal descent. They ran multiple types of analyses to ensure their results were robust and reliable. The genetic signal that emerged from this analysis was unmistakable and profound. Ancestral and present-day Picures were most closely related to each other, confirming genetic continuity in Picures Pueblo throughout the last millennium. When researchers compared Picures genomes to those of other populations, ancient and present-day alike, the results were unequivocal. No other sampled population was more closely related to the ancestral Puebloans from Pueblo Bonito than the Picures individuals were. The genetic connection was demonstrable, measurable, and undeniable. These modern Pueblo people were not just descendants of the ancestral Puebloans. They were the direct genetic descendants of the people who had built and inhabited Chaco Canyon over 1,000 years ago. The evidence went even deeper than general genetic similarity. Among the ancient individuals buried in Room 33 at Pueblo Bonito, the archaeologists had discovered something remarkable. All the individuals found in that special chamber carried the same, very rare mitochondrial haplotype, designated as B2Y1. This specific genetic marker had an extraordinarily low frequency in global populations. Yet when researchers tested the modern Picures Pueblo community, they found one individual who carried this exact same rare haplotype. The probability of this occurring by chance was vanishingly small. This was not just evidence of general descent. This was a direct genetic link, a familial connection spanning more than 500 years of history. It suggested that the individuals buried in Room 33 had held a special position, perhaps as an elite family or dynasty, and that their genetic lineage had persisted unbroken in the Picures Pueblo community down to the present day. The implications were staggering. The ancestral Puebloans had not vanished. They had migrated to new settlements, adapted to new environments, and their descendants carried not just cultural traditions, but their actual genetic material. The old narrative of civilizational collapse crumbled before this genetic evidence. What looked like disappearance was actually relocation and continuation. The ancestral Puebloans were never lost. They had always been here, persisting in descendants who maintained their ancestors' memory across centuries. But the study revealed something else that was equally important. It found no evidence of population decline before European arrival. The genetic data showed continuity, not collapse. And it found no Athabascan ancestry in individuals predating 1500 CE, challenging earlier hypotheses about outside groups invading or mixing with the population. During the era when the ancestral Puebloans supposedly disappeared, this meant the narrative of external catastrophe, of invasion, or massive demographic replacement was not supported by the genetic evidence. The ancestral Puebloans had controlled their own destiny. They had made their own choices about where to live and how to organize their society. The study also produced something that had long been missing from archaeological and genetic research. It validated the oral histories. When Picura's tribal leadership spoke about their unbroken connection to Chaco Canyon, when they maintained that their ancestors had built those great houses, when they insisted that their cultural traditions represented a continuous lineage stretching back over 1,000 years, they were not engaging in wishful thinking or cultural mythology. They were speaking a truth that science had now confirmed. Their elders, as Picura's governor Wayne Yaza would later say, had always known the truth. This genetic research was not revealing something previously unknown to the Pueblo peoples themselves. It was validating knowledge they had always possessed. The methodology of this research was noteworthy for another reason entirely. This was how science should work when studying indigenous peoples and their histories. The research questions came from within the community. The tribal nation maintained sovereignty over the genetic data. They controlled how the findings were presented and interpreted. They decided whether to publish, when to publish, and in what manner. They even decided to include DNA data that had been collected decades earlier by other researchers, data that had generated controversy because of a lack of advanced consultation with indigenous communities. By taking control of that data, the Picura's Pueblo transformed it from an example of scientific colonialism into a tool serving tribal interests. This collaborative approach represented a paradigm shift in how genetic research with indigenous communities should be conducted. For too long, outside researchers had come to indigenous territories, collected materials, conducted analysis, published findings, and moved on, all without meaningful consultation or benefit to the communities involved. Indigenous peoples had rightly pointed out that this research model reflected and reinforced colonial power dynamics. It treated indigenous peoples as passive subjects rather than active participants in the construction of knowledge about themselves. It assumed that Western scientific methods were superior to indigenous knowledge systems, even when those indigenous systems had preserved accurate information over centuries. The Picura study demonstrated that indigenous control of research, far from compromising scientific rigor, could actually enhance it. When communities asked the research questions that mattered most to them, when they brought their own knowledge systems to the table alongside Western scientific methods, when they maintained oversight over how their genetic data was used, the result was research that was both scientifically rigorous and culturally meaningful. It produced findings that validated multiple ways of knowing simultaneously. The genetic evidence confirmed what the oral histories had always maintained. Science and tradition, rather than being in opposition, could reinforce and illuminate each other. The broader implications of this research extended far beyond the specific question of Picura's ancestry. It suggested that throughout the ancestral Puebloan world, the same pattern of continuity likely held true. Modern Pueblo communities across the Southwest, including the Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, Laguna, and many others, were almost certainly the direct descendants of the ancient ancestral Puebloans. The great houses and cliff dwellings scattered throughout Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah were not the remnants of a vanished civilization. They were the ancestral heritage of peoples who had survived, adapted, and persisted through centuries of change, including the profound disruption caused by European colonization. The study also raised important questions about how knowledge had been produced and transmitted. How had Western academia come to believe in the narrative of ancestral Puebloan collapse and disappearance? Partly, it was because archaeologists had focused on the dramatic nature of the abandonment, on the empty ruins and silent sites. They had read absence as extinction. They had interpreted relocation as catastrophic flight. They had allowed their interpretations to diverge from what indigenous peoples were telling them. Partly, it was because indigenous voices had been systematically marginalized and dismissed. If the dominant institutions of knowledge production had listened to and respected Pueblo oral histories from the beginning, the mystery would never have been a mystery at all. This historical moment carried profound significance for how Western science and indigenous knowledge systems might interact going forward. For centuries, the default assumption had been that Western science was the gold standard of truth, and that indigenous knowledge systems were quaint relics of the past, valuable perhaps for cultural preservation, but not for understanding how the world actually worked. The Picura study challenged this hierarchy. It showed that indigenous oral histories, maintained over more than 1,000 years, could preserve accurate information about population continuity and ancestral connection. It showed that indigenous communities understood their own history accurately, even when that history had been questioned and contradicted by academic experts. The implications extended to other aspects of how we understand the ancestral Puebloans. Consider the architecture of their great houses, with their precise astronomical alignments. Consider their agricultural innovations, their sophisticated understanding of water management in an arid environment. Consider their extensive trade networks and their complex social organization. These were the accomplishments of a remarkable people who had mastered the challenges of their environment. When they chose to relocate in the late 1200s, they did so as a viable, functioning society, making a deliberate choice, not as a people fleeing disaster. They established new settlements in the Rio Grande Valley and other locations where their descendants continue to maintain many of the cultural practices and traditions that their ancestors had developed. The continuity of their cultural heritage is visible everywhere if one knows how to look for it. In the pottery styles of modern Pueblo peoples, one can see design elements that directly echo the ceramics produced by ancestral Puebloans 1,000 years ago. In the kivas, the circular ceremonial chambers used by Pueblo communities, one sees architectural continuity with ancestral, Puebloan spiritual spaces. In the languages spoken by Pueblo peoples, there are linguistic elements traceable back through centuries. In the agricultural practices, including the cultivation of corn, beans, and squash using traditional methods, there is ecological continuity. In the religious ceremonies and spiritual beliefs, particularly those related to the earth, water, and the seasonal cycles, there is ideological continuity. What this genetic study has definitively established is that this cultural continuity is rooted in biological continuity. The people who maintain these traditions are not just carrying forward cultural memory. They are the actual descendants of the people who originated these traditions. They carry in their DNA the inheritance of their ancestors. This has profound implications for how we understand human civilization and cultural persistence. It suggests that civilizations do not simply vanish in sudden collapses. They transform, adapt, relocate, and often persist in ways that may not be immediately obvious to outside observers. It suggests that when we declare a civilization gone or lost, we may simply be looking in the wrong place or listening to the wrong voices. It honors the persistence of Pueblo peoples who had maintained their oral histories and cultural practices despite centuries of pressure to abandon them. It vindicates the insistence of tribal leaders that their connection to ancestral sites was not merely cultural but biological, not merely spiritual, but also demonstrable through scientific methods. The research has practical implications for contemporary issues. Genetic connections to ancient sites strengthen legal claims and support arguments for protection of sacred sites. The genetic evidence establishing Picura's connection to Pueblo Bonito strengthens the tribe's voice in decisions about how Chaco Canyon, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is managed and protected. For the broader American public, this research offers an opportunity to reconsider what we think we know about our own history. The narrative of the American Southwest is often told as a story of Spanish colonization and American expansion, with indigenous peoples either vanished or marginalized. But the genetic and archaeological evidence suggests a deeper continuity. The civilizations that flourished in the Southwest centuries before European arrival did not disappear. Many of them, including the ancestral Puebloans, persisted. Their descendants are still there, still maintaining connections to their ancestral lands, still carrying forward traditions and knowledge accumulated over 1,000 years. The implications of this research also extend to how we understand human adaptation and resilience. The ancestral Puebloans faced profound environmental and social challenges. They had to adapt to climate variability and periodic droughts. They had to maintain social cohesion while managing growth and resource constraints. They eventually had to relocate to new territories and establish new communities. Yet they did not collapse or disappear. They survived and adapted, and their descendants are part of the vibrant Pueblo communities of the American Southwest today. This is a story not of failure, but of resilience, not of vanishing, but of transformation and continuity. Scientists continue to conduct research into the genetic history of ancestral Puebloans and Pueblo peoples. As DNA sequencing technology continues to improve and become more accessible, and as more communities consent to participate in genetic research under collaborative models that respect their autonomy and interests, we will likely discover even more details about the patterns of migration, settlement, and cultural development in the ancient Southwest. Future research may reveal genetic connections between modern Pueblo communities and specific ancient sites. It may illuminate the timing and routes of migration from the Four Corners region. It may provide insights into how ancestral Puebloan populations adapted to their new environments and how they integrated with existing populations in the Rio Grande Valley and elsewhere. The story of the ancestral Puebloans and their descendants is not a story of vanishing civilizations and lost cultures. It is a story of resilience and adaptation, of knowledge preserved through oral tradition and embodied in genetic inheritance, of communities that maintained their identity and continuity through centuries of profound change. The genetic research that emerged in 2025 did not discover something previously unknown. Rather, it validated and confirmed what indigenous peoples had always known and maintained. It showed that science and tradition, when approached with mutual respect and genuine collaboration, can produce knowledge that is richer and more complete than either could produce alone. The ancestral Puebloans never vanished. They are still here, in the descendants who carry their genetic code deep within every cell of their bodies, maintain their cultural practices across seasons and years, speak their languages within their homes and communities, and preserve their stories for the next generation. They are in the descendants who work to protect sacred sites like Chaco Canyon and claim their role in determining how these places are managed and studied. They are in the communities that continue to farm corn, beans, and squash, using traditional methods refined across 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge. They are in the artists who create pottery echoing ancient designs, bringing ancestral aesthetics into the modern world. They are in the spiritual leaders who maintain ceremonial traditions, keeping alive the connection between their people and the land, water, and sky that have sustained them since time immemorial. They are in every Pueblo child who learns the history of their people in school and community gatherings and understands themselves as part of a lineage stretching back more than 1,000 years, connected not just by culture and tradition, but by the actual genetic material they inherited from their ancestors. The mystery that captivated American imagination for centuries has been solved not through the discovery of some hidden archaeological treasure or a newly deciphered ancient text sitting in a museum archive. It was solved through listening finally to the voices that had been speaking that truth all along, through recognizing that indigenous peoples held knowledge that Western science had been slow to acknowledge. The ancestral Puebloans never left. They only moved forward, relocating to new territories, adapting to new environments, establishing new communities, but carrying their heritage with them into the future, waiting patiently for the world to finally catch up and listen to their story with respect and genuine understanding.